Hello everyone, welcome to our channel, 635 Ministries. My name is Drew Ayers, and today I'm going to be presenting on the first presentation in our Rescue Mission series, specifically covering abortion. And I'm going to be making a scientific, philosophical, political, and biblical argument for the pro-life view. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So, as I've talked about in the intro video, the Rescue Mission series is intended to biblically educate and enable Christians to engage with people on controversial topics and rescue them from non-biblical, false, and because they're non-biblical, destructive worldviews. I hope also that this series will bring more people to see the light of Christ, serve as a place of healing, and it will also serve to edify the church in biblical doctrine. So this was actually, even though this is the fourth video that I published under this series, this was actually the first presentation I gave when I originally did this series earlier on. I actually gave this presentation back in May. Ever since then, I've presented it one other time with some added material. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. So in section 1, we're going to discuss the question, what is abortion? How is it done? What procedures are involved? And I think that this is important, first off, because when many people think of abortion, they might not even know what they're talking about, other than what people have actually told them. So there are a couple of definitions that are thrown out there on the internet. Here's just a couple. I list 5 here. Planned Parenthood, which is probably one of the largest organizations advocating for the pro-choice view, says that, quote, abortion is a very safe way to end a pregnancy. Yale Medicine says that abortion is the termination of a pregnancy before the fetus can survive outside the uterus. Okay, so it's a little bit more specific than the first one. Then you have some people like Answers in Genesis, which is an apologetics ministry that says that, quote, abortion is the killing of an unborn child in his or her mother's womb. Obviously, that differs in its definition compared to the other ones. And so I want to kind of, as part of this presentation, first off, hope to highlight what actually is abortion at the end. But I think that to begin, I need to define, well, how is an abortion actually carried out? And essentially, there are 2 types of abortions. There's a surgical abortion and a medical abortion. So a surgical abortion is divided up generally into 3 different procedures, depending on the stage of pregnancy a woman is in. So there's a first trimester abortion, which is typically up to 13 weeks. This is called suction aspiration and curettage. A second trimester abortion, which is up to 24 weeks or 6 months, is called a dilatation and curettage, and I'm going to go into what these procedures are here shortly in the next couple slides. And a third trimester abortion is called an injection and stillbirth. A medical abortion is also called a pill abortion. This can be done up to about 11 weeks. After 11 weeks, the failure rate becomes higher and the risks become more complicated to the mother. The risks increase substantially and failure rate increases. And this involves taking 2 pills, mifepristone and misoprostol, typically. So let's dive into this a little more. Mifepristone is the first pill that a woman takes whenever she undergoes a medical abortion. Basically what happens is this pill blocks progesterone, which is a hormone that nourishes the baby. And so therefore, whenever you block that from reaching the baby, it breaks down the lining of the uterus and ultimately kind of starves the baby, so to speak. The second pill, typically this is going to be under the name misoprostol, although you can take a more general class of pills under this that act similarly to misoprostol. What this does is it causes severe contractions to force the dead baby out of the uterus. There is another definition that is called the medical definition. It's different from what I actually just said here, and let's just go ahead and read that. This is from Yale Medicine, whom we quoted earlier. They say that a medical abortion is the following, quote, mifepristone is a medication that blocks progesterone activity in a female's body. Progesterone is a critical hormone for supporting an early pregnancy The second medication, misoprostol, causes contractions and expels the pregnancy tissue. It typically takes 12 to 24 hours to pass the tissue. Now that sounds an awful lot like what I actually just said. But if you actually notice, there is a difference in the terminology that's used. And I bring this up now because it's going to have it's going to be a profound point in my argument later on. Because if you notice, I defined mifepristone as a pill that blocks progesterone and therefore kills the baby, and that misoprostol causes contractions to force the dead baby out of the uterus. However, the medical definition, instead of saying that this is a baby, it calls it pregnancy tissue or simply the tissue. And so remember, I encourage you to remember this distinction for section 3b. Okay? I want to point this out early. Effects of a medical abortion. You can research this yourself. I'm just going to basically give a brief overview. Psychological. The baby will be about 1 inch long at 9 weeks. There are profound features that you can see, such as eyes and hands and actual skeletal structures. The mom can see this, and this can be psychologically damaging. There are physical effects. If one study actually said that there will be definitely bleeding, probably for 9 to 16 days, but one study found that there were 8% of women had bleeding for over 30 days, and 1% of women will require hospitalizations due to excessive bleeding resulting from this. There will be severe abdominal pain. That is probably, well, reasonable to assume given the effects of the second pill. And there isn't going to be an infection risk. And typically this is caused if all the tissue is not passed out of the mother. There was a study that was done on 42,000 women in Finland that said, quote, "In summary, the Finnish registries revealed that first trimester medical abortions with mifepristone and a prostaglandin, typically misoprostol, it resulted in 20 out of every 100 women with a significant adverse event and about 16 out of 100 women hemorrhaging excessively. And it said that 7 out of every 100 women with tissue left inside." So that part where it says 7% of women had tissue left inside, that's where the infection risk can come in. So it's not completely safe, is the point I'm trying to make here. So let's talk more about how a surgical abortion is done. So the first trimester abortion that I talked about previously was called a suction and curettage, and essentially what happens is the baby's bones are not fully formed during this, and therefore it is able to be sucked through a very powerful suction tube. I don't know the diameter on it, but it is large enough so that way the baby's arms and its head and its skull, it can pass through that tube, basically being ripped apart. The suction force on this tube is about 10 times the strength of a vacuum cleaner. And then you'll have a curette which will go in and it will scrape the lining of the uterus to try to make sure all the tissue is removed. This is the most common surgical abortion done, by the way. A second trimester abortion is called a dilatation and curettage. What will happen is the baby is too large, its bones are kind of stronger, and so it can't actually fit through and just be sucked out through the tube and ripped apart. So what the doctor has to do is to actually go in and basically rip the baby limb by limb after dilating the uterus to make it larger, and basically go in and just pull the baby piece by piece. And they also have a special instrument that's not shown in this video that will actually crush the skull and then pull the baby out. And then they'll take a curette and scrape the lining of the uterus, similar to the first trimester abortion. Third trimester abortion, called an injection and stillbirth procedure. This is accomplished whenever the baby is very large, and so what they'll do is they'll inject basically a poison through the womb into the baby, and typically this is digoxin is what I've heard it called. This will basically kill the baby, which will cause the woman to eventually go into contractions because there's dead tissue and the woman's body's like, I need to get rid of this. And so there will be contractions that are caused, and the doctor might say, hey, whenever you start having these contractions, come in and we'll deliver the dead baby. Or maybe possibly the doctor might advise the woman to give birth in her house. The effects of a surgical abortion, obviously those are probably going to be a little more potentially damaging than a medical abortion. Planned Parenthood says abortion is safe. It says unless there's a rare and serious complication that's not treated, there's no risk to your overall health or your ability to have healthy pregnancies in the future. It says it doesn't cause infertility, doesn't cause depression or mental health issues. All right, now that's a very blanketed statement that says it will cause none. Not even a risk of it is what this implies to me. However, there are definitely, and I'm going to just list 4 studies that I've found here with the links that have shown that there are high psychological effects as a result of abortions. And I don't know if these were necessarily all surgical abortions, but for the sake of the argument, let's just assume that they are. Once said that women who aborted a first pregnancy were 5 times more likely to report subsequent substance abuse than women who carried to term, and they were 4 times more likely to report substance abuse compared to those who suffered a natural loss. So that's more comparing apples to apples. So when they compared people who had an elective abortion versus people who had a natural miscarriage, it said that the people who had the abortion were 4 times more likely to report substance abuse. This last one actually, it said, quote, women who had undergone an abortion experienced an 81% increased risk of mental health problems, and nearly 10% of the incidence of mental health problems was shown to be attributable to abortion. That one, if I remember correctly, that one was actually a study done on 800,000 women. So that has a very, very large sample size. This next section I did debate about including, but I want to bring up 2 stories, two stories of 2 different people. One is from a person whose name is Abby Johnson. She was a former Planned Parenthood member for about 8 years. You can find all this information on our website. In 2009, she assisted in a 13-week abortion guided by ultrasound. So this would either have been a first trimester or second trimester abortion. After seeing this, she decided it was so horrific that she left Planned Parenthood, who actually proceeded to try to issue a gag order on her, so that way she wouldn't talk about the horrors that she had seen. If any of you all have ever heard of Emmett Till, this is from the website abort73.com, and they described this 14-year-old whose name was Emmett Till, and basically he had been beaten to the point of death because he was black. And whenever I think he was down in Mississippi when he was killed, and whenever they sent his body back to his mother decided to have an open casket of the basically beaten body. And people were trying to advise her to say, hey, you shouldn't do this. This is going to offend a lot of people. But his mom had courage to keep the casket open because she was like, people need to know what actually happened and what was actually happening to black people. And as you see this quote, Reverend Al Sharpton, basically, and I've heard this quoted at other places too, this event and the courage that this mom had actually was a catalyst for the civil rights movement, not just for black people, but also for white people who saw this and was like, we need to do something about this. And so, for those who are watching this video, I therefore think it is very important to actually understand the gravity of what's actually going on. This is not just occurring in a closet somewhere, and it's out of sight, out of mind. This is an actual reality, or maybe a better way to put it, this is not just a theoretical exercise that is just a political issue. This is an actual real event that is actually happening. And And I think that I think that the reason I want to put these pictures on the next slide, these are going to be actual abortion pictures. I give the sources of them to show that they're not faked. The reason I do this is because if someone is going to support abortion or someone's going to have an abortion, I want to warn them of the horrors actually to come. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to count to 3, and when I go to 3, I'm going to go to the next slide. That way it gives you, if you do not want to look, that is your right. You do not have to look. You can skip ahead in the video. And then when I switch to the next slide, I'll say that I've gone to the next slide on section 2. But I'm going to show these pictures on the next slide for those reasons. So 1, 2, 3. So now I've went to the next slide on section 2. Abortion. So in this one, I want to actually talk about, well, you know, what's the actual statistics on abortion? First off, talk about, if you look at the death rates of people per 100,000 in the United States, this is 2016 and 2017 data from the CDC. I went back that far, that way it was good, reliable, adjusted data, adjusted for errors. So it was good statistics. And you can see, to no surprise, that the number 2 killers are heart disease and cancer. That's been that way for quite a long time in this country. But if I challenge this, because if I take into account abortions, this is what the graph would look like. And this is a properly scaled graph based on 862,320 abortions being performed in 2017. Ever since 1973, when Roe v. Wade was passed, there have been 63.5 million abortions conducted in this country. This rivals the amount of people that have died in World War II, actually, completely. Not just Americans, but worldwide. This rivals that, essentially. And so this, again, I just want to put this graph up here. I'm not going to bore you all with statistics, but I want to put this graph up to show that this is a very prevalent topic. This is a very prevalent procedure that's going on, and likely you do know somebody who has had an abortion. And so I think that's why I think it's important not just to throw this as a closet, throw this in, in the closet as a closet issue, so to speak, but this is a prevalent reality that needs to be addressed. In contrast to what Bill Nye has said, that we should just move on to bigger things. No, this is a huge thing. And Bill Nye is he's a strong advocate for this type of mentality, as we need to be on to bigger things, bigger issues, not consulting things like abortion, which I think is stupid. So section 3, this is gonna be mostly apologetical, meaning this falls into the realm of Christian apologetics, meaning defending the faith intellectually and rationally. And so in this section, I'm going to be given the case for being pro-life from a scientific, philosophical, and political grounds as well. So my pro-life argument is simple. I say, premise 1, it isn't wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. 2, I say abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being, and therefore abortion is wrong. That's essentially what I'm going to make the case here for. Now, for this argument to be true, you have to have 2 things generally happen. 1 is that it must be logically valid, and 2, the premises must be true. So I obviously have to address the first point. Well, is it logically valid? And this is probably more academic than and more nuanced. I think it's pretty easy to see how it is logical, but for a formal proof, I'm going to just kind of run through this real quick in these next couple slides. I basically rearranged the pro-life argument to say, well, if someone kills an innocent human being, that's wrong. And if someone has an abortion, then someone kills intentionally an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is morally wrong. So logistically, it is logically valid. say someone kills an innocent human being. B is something is wrong. C is someone has an abortion. If A goes to B, C goes to A, then C goes to B. Okay, so if this doesn't make sense, pause the video, go back to the previous slide, look over it, think through it, and just kind of think through how that is logically valid. So the second point that we're going to, this is mostly the focus of section 3, is that the premises must be true. Okay, and that's kind of what I'm going to be showing. Because if they are true, then the conclusion that abortion is wrong has to follow. Okay. So if we look at premise 1, it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. I'm going to assume, for sake of brevity, that this is true. Some people will say that this is not the case. Like, they'll say it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being except when X, Y, and Z. Okay, so like say someone may agree with premise 2. They may say that, yeah, abortion kills an innocent human being, but they'll say, well, in cases of rape, it's okay to kill an innocent human being, so to speak. Like when people say that rape is justifiable grounds for an abortion. Okay. But for the sake of this, sake of brevity for this, because I think that most of the arguments pertain to premise number 2, I'm just going to assume that premise number 1 is true. Okay, so it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. So let's evaluate premise 2. Abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. And to really answer this question, going back to the slide here, I'm going to mostly be arguing, okay, well, what is a human being? What is the unborn? Who is the unborn? You know? So let's look at this from a scientific response. Now I'm just going to start off by just conducting 2 thought exercises here to get us thinking. Let me ask the question, is a bacterial cell a life? Well, let me ask you this. What are antibiotics? And if you look at the medical definition of antibiotics, it says that they are medicines that help stop infections caused by bacteria. The word antibiotic means against life. It says that it is a drug that kills germs in your body. Most people use this term when they're talking about medicine that kills bacteria. So notice that constantly the term that's being used, killing, killing, killing. Okay, and they assume when they give this definition that a bacteria cell is a life. Now let me give another scenario. Let's say that you're going to Mars and you set foot on there, or somebody else, and let's say that they find a dead embryo or a fetus in some cave on Mars. Doesn't matter the location. My question is, what do you think that the newspapers are going to say upon this discovery? Are they going to say, A, evidence for life has been found on Mars? Or are they going to say, B, still no evidence for life found on Mars? Well, if I'm a betting man, I say that if you had astronauts who went to Mars and found a dead fetus in a cave and they brought it back to Earth, all the headlines in every newspaper is going to say evidence for life has been found on Mars. And therefore, I want to ask this question to abortionists. If medically, scientifically, you say that a bacteria is a life, and that's scientific, but you say that a fetus is not a life, and this is a picture of a baby in his or her mother's womb, seen via ultrasound. And the reason I bring this up is that science is pretty determinate on when they say that a life actually begins. Here, I'm not going to read these quotes, but here's 2 quotes from 2 standard embryology textbooks that basically argue that whenever a zygote comes into being, that is when a sperm unites with an egg and basically forms a complete DNA set, that is the formation of a completely new organism and is a member of the human species. Even when I asked ChatGPT this, which is always reliable, that's sarcasm, it said from a biological standpoint, human life can be said to begin at conception, fertilization. And it actually says many scientists agree that this is when the process of human development begins, though they often avoid making claims about personhood or moral status at this age. Okay, now we're going to come back to that in section 3b, but let me make the point here is that science has basically agreed that an embryo in a fetus is a life. The scientific community has to concede this. It's pretty standard. So I say it's not a scientific debate on when life begins, but it is more primarily a philosophical debate on when a person or a human being begins. You see the difference? And this is the reason I brought up the two scenarios before, is that they say that a bacteria is a life, and in their daily usage they do say that a fetus is a life. But what people really mean is that they say a fetus is not a person, and this is a crucial point for clarifying the abortion debate. So let me give a philosophical response now in section 3b. The real crux of the matter is that, as we've discussed, a fetus is a life from a scientific point of view. And so what most abortionists really mean is that a fetus is not a person or a human with a right to life. But let me ask, wait, so what do abortionists say is an actual person then? What constitutes when a human has a right to life? So here's just a couple of definitions. I put scientific opinions. They're not really, I put that in quotes because they're not really scientific, as we've already discussed. They're more so philosophical reasonings on, well, when a fetus, a life, actually becomes a person. They're more philosophical. And so I'm not going to read all these, but you can pause the video and read through them. One thing I want to point out is that all of these, like for instance, Joseph Fletcher has 15 qualities that must have a fetus that meets certain intelligence, self-awareness, self-control, sense of time, etc. requirements to be qualified as a person. I want to point that out because if you look at all these, most of them focus on what's called a performance view of humanity, meaning that a fetus must have a certain level of performance before he or she has a right to life. So let me just test these criteria. I'm just going to test 6 here, okay? 6 listed here. The first one being that a fetus must exhibit a conscious desire to live by valuing its own life. All right? Now I use the term "it's" there, not because that's what I'm saying, but that's because that's what the other side is saying, okay? So let me present a counterexample, right? So does a newborn or does an Alzheimer's or dementia patient, do they have a right to life because they don't have a conscious desire to live? They don't really value their own life. And also I want to ask, okay, well, when does this actually occur? How do you legislate when this fetus actually becomes a person, when it has that conscious desire? I mean, this needs to be set in stone, a set in stone law, because you're playing with people's lives here, right? So how do you legislate this? More specifically, let me ask, when does consciousness occur? Okay, what chemical causes consciousness? That goes on the first point, right? When do you actually set that dividing line between when something does not have a right to life and someone does? Okay, why this specific criteria and not the others? All right, why is this the determining factor for someone having a right to life? And also, what is meant by desire? Does it mean immediate desire? Like, do you actually have to have an immediate desire to live, or potential desire, meaning you have the potential to desire it? Because let me ask, a suicide victim does not have the desire to live. This person, by definition, does not value his or her own life. They want to take it. But the fact of the matter is that we help suicide victims because we assume and want them to have the potential to have that desire. Number 2 is similar to the first one. It exhibits a certain intellectual ability. So again, I asked, do the following have a right to life? What about newborns, Alzheimer's and dementia patients, or people with Down syndrome? right? Or just people with mental health issues. Okay, mental health is classified as a disease. Well, it can be classified as a disease or something that's just not right. And so I ask, okay, if someone has, say, a learning disability, doesn't have to necessarily be Down syndrome, does that person have a right to life? And quite honestly, this sounds very, very shady too, similar to the first one, because it's like, well, what is that threshold? How do you legislate this? And I say it's actually similar to racism because does this mean that people who are smarter have a greater right to life than others? Or put another way, are they more human? Are they more human beings? Are they more persons? And again, why this specific criteria and not the others? Okay, what is it about intellect that gives humans an inherent right to life? So according to this criteria, you could have a chimpanzee that is a person, but a fetus. I give this ultrasound picture again, but I also counter, well, even a newborn may not qualify as a person. So if I test numbers 3 and 4, the fetus becomes viable, and the fetus exits the female's womb. So this is like, up until birth. Well, again, I ask, why the specific criteria, not the others? What about changing a fetus's location, a baby's location, 8 inches from inside the womb to the other side of the birth canal? What is it about that gives someone a right to life? What about fetal surgery? And specifically, I talk about open surgery. That is where you basically operate on a fetus while it's within the mother's womb, or he or she is within the mother's womb, or you either remove the fetus from the womb, operate on it, and put it back in. Well, does this fetus now say, I was not a person while I was in the womb, now I am a person while I'm in the womb, but now I go back in my mother's womb and I'm not a person anymore? Seems quite absurd to me. And the other question I ask is what do you mean by viable? Is this with life support or without life support? And I say, what if fetal viability is 24 weeks in the United States but 36 weeks in Africa? So does this mean that there are more people that have a right to life in the United States than in Africa? Like, if you have, say, an American-born citizen who is on vacation in Africa, then does that mean that it is okay to commit an abortion? Because fetal viability is 36 weeks in Africa. So if you're like 30 weeks along, it's okay to have an abortion in Africa, but it's not in North America? That seems kind of absurd to me. And so for those who also want to know, the record for the earliest birth is held by, as far as I'm aware, Curtis Means, 21 weeks, 1 day old. I showed 2 pictures, one as a toddler, one as a very, very young baby, and the other as a toddler, and quite honestly, I could say that looks like a healthy toddler to me. Number 5, the fetus can feel pain. Again, you have to argue not just from assertion, but also the person has to argue why this specific criteria, not the others. What's the argument for why this enables a person to have the right to life? Nerve cells develop within the 5th week, so even if this did determine whether a fetus was a person or not, this would outlaw a lot of the good majority of the abortions that are performed. Number 3, if I kill or harm someone in a way that doesn't cause them pain, such as through a fatal gunshot, a lethal injection, etc., does that make this right? So I put a person sleeping here as like, well, if I kill a person while they're sleeping, they don't feel pain. Well, does that mean that they do not have the right to life and it's okay that I do that? Again, that seems quite absurd to me. Number 6 is the fetus becomes independent. Again, why the specific criteria? They have to argue for it. I question the toddlers, and I give this picture of this toddler in the woods. I'm like, well, best I can tell, if this toddler was left to his own devices, I do not know if this toddler would make it more than a week out in the woods. And I also ask, well, what happens when your parents become dependent on you? Do they forfeit their right to life? And this kind of factors into the topic in the debate over euthanasia, which I'm not going to talk about in this debate or in this presentation here, as a totally separate debate. Well, not totally separate, because a lot of the principles applied here applies there with some nuances, but I'd still think that the question here applies. What happens when your parent becomes dependent on you? Do they forfeit that right to life? And that's quite absurd as well. So therefore, do people with Alzheimer's or dementia have a right to life? What about people with Down syndrome? They're not necessarily self-sufficient in certain stages of their life. So it's like, do they forfeit their right to life? So summary section 3 is that science says life begins at conception. That a person, I say that a person, this is why I submit, that a person also begins at conception is the most reasonable philosophical conclusion for our reality. I quote Ben Shapiro here, who says, "You are not a potential human life, but a human life with potential." And I therefore say abortion kills a person. So if we go back to my argument here, examining premise 2, abortion kills a human being. The question is it intentional? Is a human being innocent? It's in the womb. I don't think anybody's going to argue that abortion is intentional in like the vast majority of cases, and that a fetus has not done anything to say it is completely guilty or in any way guilty. So I think that those two can be reasonably concluded, and therefore, logically, abortion is morally wrong. And we could end there, but I want to kind of give more of a political response with objections, and this is more from me being an apologist. And I'm going to just kind of you'll see what I mean by this. I'm just going to give a couple of common objections and the responses here. Because the question is, well, yes, I may say that the abortion is morally wrong, but I don't think it should be in the political realm. Well, I'm going to argue kind of against that. So the first objection is, I personally oppose abortion, but you shouldn't force that view on others. My response is, okay, I'm curious. I personally oppose child abuse. Should the government have a law that prohibits child abuse? Because if abortion is wrong, then to say that you shouldn't force that view on others is kind of absurd, because basically all laws force their views on others. So like, for instance, murdering, that forces a view on somebody. Child abuse, anti-child abuse laws, that forces a view on somebody that they cannot abuse their child. Second objection: religion needs to keep its hands out of politics. Separation of church and state. My response is, okay, then since thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, and thou shalt not lie are a part of the Bible, should these be laws? The fact of the matter is that separation of church and state doesn't necessarily mean separation of morality and state. And I could talk a lot more about this, but for sake of time, I'm going to move on before I get down a rabbit hole. So, third objection, both candidates are evil, so I'm not going to vote for either. My response is, everyone is evil. Look at Romans 3, specifically verse 23. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. In any political ballot, you're always going to be voting for the lesser of two evils. Fourth objection, you can't legislate a moral issue. My response to that is, well, is that statement you just made right or wrong? And I think that kind of speaks for itself. Just think on that a little bit. Fifth one, the government shouldn't interfere with a woman's rights. And to this one, I think this one might be the most common one. Probably. Because whenever you hear the pro-choice side, they constantly stress women's reproductive rights. And the government shouldn't interfere with that, etc. And I want to say, I agree. Now you might be like, what? I agree. If a fetus is the same thing as an appendix. And I agree with that. However, as I've talked about, the fetus is a person, and therefore I would ask the question when someone makes this statement, what if a mother is pregnant with a girl? Or I would just simply respond, I agree, if a fetus is not a human person, or a human being, or a person. And then I would lead into talking about how a fetus is an actual person. Okay, so just pause the video, look through these objections and responses, and kind of internalize them. So section 4, this is really what I love, because I think this section is going to just be really beautiful, is I'm going to give the biblical response. And I'm going to talk about some objections too, although this presentation is already getting kind of long, so I'm going to kind of run through the objections. You can pause the video if you want to look at the responses, but I'm going to mostly be talking about what the Bible has to say about this. And to do this, I have to go to the beginning. So in Genesis 1, 26 through 27, God makes man, humankind, and he says at the end, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. All right. So God creates man in his own image. Well, if you look a little later after the flood, God says this to Noah and the 7 other people who were saved. He says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Now that for there, I'm going to interpret as a reasoning. Like it's explaining. It can almost be translated as because God made man in his own image. And so what I submit here is that it seems that the explanation for condemning murder, like shedding the blood of man, is that by taking a human life, you are destroying somebody made in the image of God. God is the one who recognizes a person with intrinsic value because that person is made in the image of God. And this is that substance view that I was talking about earlier when I was addressing the objections to personhood, namely objection 1. This is what I was talking about being the substance, that because that person is made in the image of God, it is wrong to basically destroy that person, murder that person. Now, some people may say that, well, and this has big issues for a pro-choice Christian, and I may put that term Christian in quotes, because I would have to say, if you're a Christian, how could you support sin? So I'd have to say that. But I'd say that this is an issue for that person, because you would have to say that at some point, say, I don't know what that point would be, this person becomes made in the image of God. But before that, no, that fetus is not made in the image of God. It's okay to kill. It's okay to terminate that pregnancy. That's what they'll say. But then at some, I don't know what, some weeks say, that person's made in the image of God. That to me seems kind of absurd and not supported biblically. And this is where I kind of make the end of my case for abortion. Now, some people may say, well, I expected you to list like Psalm 139 and Jeremiah and Paul. But I think that really is I'm just going to submit my strongest argument. In that if a fetus is made in the image of God, then that fetus has a right to life that should not be taken. If it is taken, it is murder. Okay? So let me, therefore, look at the objections. So this is from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Whenever they answer the question, what does the Bible say about abortion? It says absolutely nothing. The word abortion does not appear in any translation of the Bible. And then they actually say that out of more than 600 laws of Moses, none comments on abortion. One Mosaic law about miscarriage specifically contradicts the claim that the Bible is anti-abortion, clearly stating that miscarriage does not involve the death of a human being. Okay. And then they cite Exodus 21, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. So they say that the word abortion does not appear in the Bible. Okay, I agree. But does this mean that God has no jurisdiction over new practices that occur or that are just not mentioned. The Bible is a finite book. I mean, nobody's going to argue with that. It is a finite book. It has a certain number of pages, a certain number of words. But I note that it also does not affirm abortion, one. And so therefore, I think that we have to determine our stance using principles. And so that principle is the one that I talked about before. That if you end someone's life who is made in the image of God, that's murder. If you end an innocent person's life who is made in the image of God, that's murder. Okay? The second point I want to make is that I don't know if her conclusion of the person that's writing this article, I don't know that her conclusion follows, because I think that if you read the text here, which I won't read, it's Exodus 21:22 through 25, which I'm not going to read because I encourage you all to go back and read it. I think that the person assumes that the second case only pertains to the harm of the mother. So whenever it says if there is harm, that's, unless there's a reason I'm not seeing, I don't see how that necessarily refers only to the mother. Like, if there is harm to the mother, right? The second point is that she assumes that the first scenario refers to a miscarriage. So the first scenario, whenever it says that her children come out, there is no harm, right? When her children come out, there's a miscarriage, so the child dies, but there is no harm. She assumes that harm is, again, only to the woman, right? But the word, as far as I'm aware, the word miscarriage does not occur in any translation of the Bible. It may, but I'm not so sure it does. And the third point, and this is kind of really the main point I want to make, this also pertains to Numbers chapter 5. Even if her observation is correct, how does it follow that this gives the woman an elective right to an abortion? And so I think that you're not really comparing the same situations, and this is definitely also pertains to Numbers chapter 5, which basically says that if a woman is adulterous, cheats on her husband, and she goes before the priest, there will be a judgment on her, and it says that her womb will swell and her thigh will rot. And there's various interpretations over what that can be. But I think that is more, even if that is referring to a miscarriage, so to speak, because of adultery, it's because of sin, and it's more of a judgment that's enacted upon that person. So this one more pertains to Numbers chapter 5. It doesn't really it doesn't really refute the argument that I'm making. And you can look at the pro-life argument that I made before. So objection 2, they said that life begins at birth. They quote Genesis 2:7. And then this person says that Jewish law traditionally considers that personhood begins at birth. They say Psalm 51:5, behold, I was shapen in iniquity and sinned and my mother conceived me. They say that is sexist. I don't know how that conclusion follows. And I think their main one is that Moses, Jesus, and Paul ignored every chance to condemn abortion. So they say that, why didn't the Bible say so if it's so wrong and so important? Well, when we look at what Jesus said about Jewish law, he kind of didn't really, like rabbinical law specifically, he wasn't really a big fan of it. Matthew 15, verse 3. If we actually look at, I don't know if this person's claim is actually true as well, because if you look at the first century Pharisee Josephus in his book Against Apion, book 2, verse 202, it says, the law, moreover, enjoins us to bring up all our offspring and forbids women to cause abortion of what is begotten or to destroy it afterward. And if any woman appears to have so done, she will be a murderer of her child by destroying a living creature and diminishing humankind. So this clearly basically says that's against abortion. This person was a Pharisee, so he knew if there was a certain Jewish teaching, he knew about it. And I also submit these 3 other Jewish works, not inspired scripture, but they give thought as to what the Jews thought at the time, like rabbinical law and stuff like that. And this shows that Jewish law didn't traditionally consider that personhood began at birth. but it was rather at conception, while the person was still in the womb. So if Jesus, the second thing is that if Jesus and Paul did not condemn rape specifically, does that mean it's okay? Nobody's going to argue that. Jesus probably didn't mention abortion, probably because, well, as we just saw, the Jews saw it as wrong. And in the Old Testament, the Jews saw birth as a blessing and a good thing. Barrenness was not seen as good. So honestly, Jesus probably never had to address it because it wasn't common and where he was like preaching and stuff like that. So, and this last one I want to admit is the Didache, chapter 2, verse 2. It's an early Christian document from the 2nd century that basically, as you can read here, it says you shall not abort a child or commit infanticide. So, earlier the Christian church definitely did not support abortion. This objection number 3, I actually don't necessarily consider it an objection logically, because it more so tries to say that the real biblical basis behind this anti-abortion religious crusade is the hatred of women. And that term religious crusade, I've heard that a lot. That's not just this person saying this. This is common jargon. And I want to point this out. So let me look at this, because this is not really an argument, and the reason is because I can describe something in 2 different ways. So this person says that we are on an anti-abortion religious crusade. I describe it as it is rather a defense of those helpless to defend themselves. Their description is that this blames women for sin. I say, well, hold up. God talked to Adam first in the garden because he was responsible as the man. God knew exactly what happened, but if you note, he confronted Adam first. So he was just as responsible. Demanding that the Bible demands subservience, mandating a slave-master relationship. Well, I think it's rather establishing an ordered creation where the husband is commanded to love his wife to the point of death, just like Christ. And I refer the reader to Ephesians chapter 5. And the last one is at Genesis 3:16. That's the curse. I think that's the verse where it says, it says it here, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. That's misogynistic. I counter that the curse in Genesis 3 was also applied to men as well. So it's not misogynistic. So with that, I hope that kind of ends the more philosophical and biblical, theological and stuff like that. The more apologetic dogmatics and doctrine on this topic. I'm going to be talking more about pragmatics. How do we actually move forward with this rescue mission that I propose? And I start off with saying, well, why do women get an abortion? And the Guttmacher Institute published an article here that said the reasons most frequently cited were that having a child would interfere with a woman's education, work, or ability to care for dependents. She could not afford a baby, and she did not want to be a single mother or was having relationship problems. Okay? And similarly, if you look at this is from the Charlotte Lozier Institute, if you look at about 96% of abortions are for elective reasons. There are about 3.4% of abortions that are done because of physical health concerns or abnormalities in the unborn baby. 0.4% are done as a result of rape and incest. And 0.3% are done because there is a risk to the woman's life or a major bodily function. And so the reason I want to bring all this up is because that I want to focus more on the 74% that say that they just feel like their careers are limited, or that they're not financially able to do it. They don't have the support spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, etc. And the first thing I want to submit is that I don't see that a reason to support the intentional killing of an innocent human being. I don't see how hardship can justify that, first of all. But the second point is that I want to ask from the church's standpoint, and I speak of the church maybe at your local church, but just the church as a whole, what if we address those concerns? And so I have a proposed path to educate. So that basically that's doing exactly what I did just in this presentation. To advocate, so to basically spread those ideas to your family, your friends, and your peers, educate them on this. The educate and advocate go hand in hand. And then participate. This is similar to advocate, and I say participate in church, government, and pro-life organizations. And there's others I just don't listen here, or so there are others I don't list here for the sake of brevity. But my point is that what if the church is the entity, the primary entity, and I speak of the church as the collective body here, to provide that support, to point them to Jesus Christ for people who have had an abortion, to say how Christ offers forgiveness and restitution and healing. And that's what I think that the church can really step in. And also, it could help them financially and help them spiritually and all sorts of great things. And all of this is empowered by basically by the one who has all authority in heaven and on earth given to him. Matthew chapter 28. So, with that, I'm just going to run through some conclusions here. I want to say, I submit first that abortion is the intentional killing of an innocent unborn child in his or her mother's womb. I submit that this is wrong. This is supported scientifically, philosophically, politically, and biblically. I also submit that when they make their arguments, abortionists in fact degrade human beings, and that's similar to if you define a person as having a person of a certain intellectual capability, then you basically create hierarchies, so to speak, where one person is more human than the other. It's similar to eugenics, right? And number 3 is that I encourage the church as a body, and I'm also accountable to this as well. I think that the church as a body needs to step in and educate, advocate, and participate in this. So with that, here's a couple of resources I think would be good just to check out, just to kind of understand what's actually going on. Pro-life, more pro-life, versus apologetics that I couldn't cover. Two great books. I'm not going to give a book review here because we're already running long on time. But The Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, that's a great book. It's more philosophical. It talks about mind-body dualism, which you can look up what that is, very in-depth, and she shows how mind-body dualism applies to not just abortion, but also transgenderism, same-sex marriage, and euthanasia. I thought that was a great chapter on euthanasia. So hers is more academic. It's a little bit of a harder read, but if you can make it through, you'll have some great fruit from it. And the second one is The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf. That's an excellent book, I would say, for high schoolers. It's good for lay people, good for pastors, and even good for the academic level. And there's a lot of other good academic books that go into that book. For those who really want to understand the technical arguments and the intellectual and philosophical arguments, I recommend, I don't have it listed here, but Francis J. Beckwith's book, Defending Life. That book is, I've heard it's in depth. I've not read it, but I've heard it's very rigorous and academic. So with that, if there are questions, please, you can leave a comment or you can send an email to 635ministries@gmail.com. Send an email if you want the slides as well. Subscribe to us on YouTube, turn on notifications for more things like this. I just wanted to say thank you for tuning in, for listening. I pray that this has built you up. I pray that you're able to see abortion for what it really is. Yeah, to God be all the glory.